All right, Briahna, what's on your radar?
Well, Robbie, today I want to ask a pretty difficult question. Is Israel intentionally killing its own hostages? This provocative claim, which has been circulating since shortly after the Hamas attack on October 7th, has been newly corroborated by Israeli media. Under a policy known as the Hannibal Directive, soldiers are allegedly directed to do whatever it takes to prevent hostage taking, up to and including killing the hostages themselves. A new investigation by Ynet, a major Israeli news outlet, has reported that at midnight on October 7th, the IDF instructed its soldiers to stop, quote, at all costs, any attempt by Hamas to return to Gaza, echoing language, according to Ynet, used when describing the original Hannibal Directive. According to Ynet, the actual meaning of the order is that the main goal is to stop the retreat of the activists, even if this means risking or harming the lives of civilians in the area, including the abductees themselves. Ynet confirmed that on October 7th, 70 cars were hit by Israeli tanks or anti-tank missiles or helicopters, and that at least in some cases, everyone in the vehicle was killed. Now, if you're wondering why a civilized nation would kill its own people in this way, the thinking, the logic is as follows. If IDF soldiers are never captured, they can't be used as leverage in prisoner exchanges. According to the Times of Israel, quote, the directive allows soldiers to use potentially massive amounts of force to prevent a soldier from falling into the hands of the enemy. This includes the possibility of endangering the life of the soldier in question in order to prevent his capture. Here's University of Chicago political scientist and international relations scholar John Mearsheimer, who you might remember as an early critic of American foreign policy in Ukraine, explaining this doctrine.
It's quite clear that on October 7th, a good number, we don't know what the number is, but a good number of the Israelis who were killed were not killed by Hamas. They were killed by the IDF. And I find that hardly surprising, given the nature of the fight that was taking place. It is hard to discriminate in those situations. Now, the Hannibal Doctrine is a very different matter. The argument there, or the claim there, is that what the Israelis do is that if it looks like an Israeli soldier or even an Israeli citizen is going to be captured by Hamas or some other terrorist group, to use the Israelis' language to describe those groups, then the IDF will kill those Israelis.
Now, interest in the Hannibal Doctrine has peaked this week following the release of a Hamas video featuring Israeli hostage Noah Argamani on January 15th. In the video, Argamani explains that two of the other hostages she was captured with were killed by Israeli soldiers. One died after Israeli bombs struck a house in which they were housed, she says. Another was bombed while being transported in an ambulance. Now, certainly the video of hostages recorded while in captivity should be taken with an ample grain of salt. To be clear, Israel has denied that it killed the two dead hostages. IDF spokesperson Daniel Hagari said on Monday that the IDF, quote, did not know their real-time location. We do not strike in places where we know there may be hostages. However, he added that, quote, in hindsight, we know we struck a target near to the location where they were being held. We are investigating the event and its circumstances, examining the images distributed by Hamas alongside additional information. Now, that Israel was striking near the hostages in hindsight is in and of itself a troubling admission, especially in light of the fact that Israel has a track record of denying responsibility for crimes like the murder of Palestinian-American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh for months, only admitting full fault after rounds of pressure, after successive half admissions that inched closer and closer to the truth, and after public attention has waned. First, Israel claimed Abu Akleh was shot by Palestinian fighters. Then they discounted evidence and witness claims. Then they drew out their own investigation while barring external inquiries. An admission that Israel struck near the hostages could follow that pattern. Note that Daniel Hagari was the official who ultimately offered up the delayed apology for the death of Shireen Abu Akleh. Now, to be clear, nothing can be certain at this time. But after Israel shot 3 shirtless Israeli hostages as they waved a white flag last month, investigation into whether Israel is killing its own hostages as a matter of policy is surely warranted. So let's look at the evidence. Israel has, in fact, adopted the Hannibal Doctrine as official policy in the past. The Times of Israel reported that the IDF had officially adopted the Hannibal Protocol as recently as 2016 and reported that it had been used by the IDF for, quote, decades as a method to thwart what Israel describes as uneven prisoner exchanges between Israel and Hamas. There's also a pattern of behavior by the IDF since the start of the siege of Gaza that suggests at least that hostage safety has been deprioritized. On December 12th, the IDF acknowledged an immense and complex quality of, quote, friendly fire occurred on October 7th, as reported by Ynet. Ynet also reported that the frequency of fire at the thousands of terrorists was enormous at the start, and only at a certain point did the pilots begin to slow their attacks and carefully choose the targets. Moreover, Israeli outlet Haaretz reported that a police source admitted that, quote, an IDF combat helicopter that arrived to the scene and fired at terrorists there apparently also hit some festival participants. These reports are corroborated by a video released by the IDF 2 months ago showing its soldiers seeming to fire indiscriminately on October 7th. Now, why does this matter? Firstly, it's important to remember that the nature of Hamas's attack, not just the number of civilian deaths, was used to justify the disproportionality of Israel's response. Over 24,000 Gazans have now been killed, 70% of whom are women and children. As it became clear that Israel's bombardment of Gaza would claim many more lives than were tragically taken on October 7th, a rhetorical shift emerged, emphasizing the nature of the barbaric crimes Hamas committed on October 7th, rather than the volume of deaths. The Intercept tracked the use of words like slaughter, massacre, and horrific, and found that they were reserved almost exclusively for Israelis who were killed by Palestinians rather than the other way around. The 15 9/11s metric that was going around was supplemented and then replaced by accusations of beheadings, rapes, and people burned alive, as the Gaza death toll dwarfed Israel's own. Biden, too, echoed Israeli officials as he evoked rape, beheadings, bodies burned alive as justification for his unprecedented support package for Israel's defense. Again, I'd argue that this rhetoric served a purpose, obscuring the disproportionality of Israel's response, which largely was borne by Gaza's civilian population. And of course, it didn't matter if these claims were true. As we've discussed at length on this show, the beheaded baby story was debunked, and there are no rape victims that have been as of yet identified. In fact, Haaretz reported earlier this month that, quote, police are having difficulty locating victims of sexual assault from the Hamas attack or people who witnessed such attacks, and decided to appeal to the public to encourage those who have information on the matter to come forward and give testimony. Even in the few cases in which the organization collected testimony about sexual offenses committed on October 7th, it failed to connect the acts with the victims who were harmed by them, end quote. At least 200 of the badly burned bodies, which were cited as evidence of Hamas's brutality on October 7th, turned out to be Hamas fighters who had been burned beyond recognition by Israeli artillery. Here's Israeli advisor to Netanyahu, Mark Regev, admitting as much in a now viral clip.
We had the number at 1,400 casualties, and now we've revised that down to 1,200 because we understood that we had overestimated. We made a mistake. There were actually bodies that were so badly burnt, we thought they were ours. In the end, apparently, they were Hamas terrorists. When we make a mistake, we admit it.
But before this admission, those deaths were used as evidence of Hamas's brutality and tacit justification for Israel's brutality against the civilians of Gaza. Efforts to investigate what happened to those tragically charred victims, have been thwarted by Israel's choice to bury the bodies and the vehicles together. Now, Jewish burial rites, which favor a speedy burial within 24 hours, were offered as an explanation for quite literally burying the evidence. The Jerusalem Post even reported that the cars may be shredded before being buried in order to maximize space efficiency by compacting the existing vehicles. But the choice to bury the cars was reported more than 6 weeks after October 7th, meaning that the Jewish custom of burying a loved one within 24 hours had long been made moot. Similarly, independent efforts to investigate rape claims have been thwarted by Israel. For example, in the wake of Israel's defense at The Hague genocide trials, in which it emphasized mutilation, rape, and torture, the UN Secretary General has again called for an investigation into these sexual assault claims. But Israel has ordered its health ministry not to cooperate, calling the UN committee anti-Semitic. Israel has also declined to make a tape that it has put together of October 7th atrocities available to the wider public, choosing instead to hold screenings for ideologically aligned parties. One of the few, or perhaps the only non-Zionist invited to these screenings, Owen Jones, reported that the movie contained horrible atrocities, but that it did not show any evidence of rape. What are we to make of the gap between Israel's claims and its interest in investigating those alleged atrocities? And does this pattern of non-disclosure raise a rebuttable presumption that the Hannibal Doctrine is likely to be in effect? A final note, despite representing itself as a free speech platform, efforts to click on Ynet's reporting on the Hannibal Directive story brings up a warning that the article may be, quote, spammy or unsafe. To be clear, Ynet is described as a major Israeli newspaper that, according to a write-up by New York Times journalist Nathaniel Popper at Forward magazine, avoids any overt political position. Yet Musk, for some reason, is deterring people from viewing it. This is soft censorship, and I think it's worth asking what you're being deterred from reading. So people have been talking about this for some time, and it's caused folks like Max Blumenthal, who's been doing a lot of the in-depth reporting into what really happened on October 7th, to be very stigmatized and to get a lot of pretty forceful pushback. And so it was big news when a major Israeli paper seemed to corroborate, not seemed to, but explicitly corroborated claims that this is not just accidental killings in the fog of war, as John Mearsheimer explained, but seemingly a policy to prevent Israel from being in the position of having to negotiate the release of thousands of Palestinians who are imprisoned in Israel before October 7th and now, in exchange for their own Israeli hostages.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to be very wary of false claims on both sides, because I know in terms of the helicopter bombing, I don't know if that was that same footage, but there was a viral, seen by like 30 million people clip of a helicopter blowing up supposedly people at the music festival. It turned out that was unrelated to the music festival. It wasn't depicting that. You're assigning a lot of blame here to the Israeli forces in their efforts to root out the terrorist group that have kidnapped all of these people. And again, the primary people at fault obviously are Hamas itself. Hamas should never have done this and should release all the hostages. Do I think Israel should take greater precautions, obviously, than they took in that case where they inadvertently killed those 3 people who were hostages trying to escaping? Of course. How
is it inadvertent? Did an IDF soldier not point a gun and purposefully kill those 3 hostages?
Inadvertent in that they did not mean to kill their own hostages. They did not want to kill their hostages.
This is the issue, Robbie. I think after particularly that instance, when you had three hostages who had written words in Hebrew on a sheet from where they crawled out from, who are speaking and shouting in Hebrew, who are waving a white flag, who've stripped themselves down so there can be no suspicion that they have weapons on them. One of them, a curly red-headed guy. I mean, there were a lot of indications that these people were Israeli and not Palestinian. Again, not that it should have mattered. Innocent, weaponless, surrendering Palestinians should also not be gunned down in that way. But when something like that happens, and there was a choice to shoot at them and kill them anyway, does that not raise any concerns about what Israeli policy might be with respect to its own hostages?
I just said it raises concerns. But when you're on the ground, going door to door in enemy territory, fearing attacks from the terrorist group at all times, you have a little bit of a hair trigger. Well, that's not to excuse it. There should absolutely be an investigation of what went wrong there, because the protection of the hostage lives is the most important thing. But we now have had reporting. There was a first-person account from a former, from a hostage, Agam Goldstein Almog, in the Free Press, describing the horrific conditions from her view. This is someone, right, who's not saying it on camera while Hamas has a gun to her head, saying that that people hostages have wounds that were not treated, and that girls were sexually molested by the terrorists frequently. That's a first-person account of what's going on. Look,
but she doesn't say she was molested, so it's not a.
Right.
I mean, it's a first-person account of what's going on, but not a first-person
that
account of what has happened to her.
So you can reject that if you like.
I'm not rejecting it, but that's very similar to the evidence that we've had so far. It does not strike you as curious that, again, it's not that there couldn't be very plausibly an allegation of discrete sexual violence. Sexual violence is ubiquitous in this world. But what's been alleged is that there was widespread and systemic sexual violence. And despite this allegation that there was widespread and systemic sexual violence, the Israeli police have had to put out a bulletin saying, please, somebody come forward with testimony or evidence, because we're having trouble connecting these allegations that are made by a handful of witnesses that, as we heard in the segment that we did with Max Blumenthal, have been largely discredited as unreliable narrators, attesting to what they witnessed.
Him. Viewers can decide for themselves.
Well, it's also there's forensic evidence that is not lining up with the stories that are being alleged. So I understand not taking the word of any given journalist or interlocutor at face value, but there are reports of where bodies were collected from, the age of the victims, and where they were found.
I've seen the footage, by the way. I watched the October 7th footage. You see. There's horrific video of the murders being committed. A father blown apart in front of his two boys. A grenade thrown into an area where people are hiding so that they run out, and then that they all get shot. People gunned down in their cars. The conditions of the people at the music festival, bodies everywhere.
That's what Owen Jones attested to. He attested to that, but that these claims of rape were not validated by the video. Yeah. So that's the question.
It doesn't matter to me, but...
Well, that's fine, but many of us are interested in finding out the truth of what happened and not just focusing on those facts that happen to paint Israel in a more positive light. There is no question, there is no public dispute that atrocities were committed on October 7th by Hamas, that they killed civilians in contradiction of my own morals and of international law. But isn't it equally important to find out, especially given that the world is deeply invested in the hostages that are still being kept by Hamas and getting free, and to finding out if Israel actually shares the Biden administration's stated objectives of freeing the hostages, or if they feel like the cost to Israel and having to release Palestinian prisoners, who, I gotta say, since you raised the conditions of Israeli prisoners, the statements that have come out of released prisoners in Israel is that, yes, they don't have enough food and their wounds are not treated, because people in Gaza don't have enough food and their wounds have not been treated. What they repeatedly and consistently say is that we ate what Hamas ate and we got the care that Hamas received. They were treated equally as Hamas, and to the extent that the conditions were bad, it's because Israel is denying aid and food to Gaza. That is not in dispute. By contrast, Israel does not have that same excuse with respect to how they treat their prisoners. And I cut this down for length, but there is ample reporting of sexual violence against Palestinians that has been corroborated by international authorities, including against Palestinian children. And those claims are not being weaponized in the same way to justify the October 7th attacks on Israel.
I think that's fantastic to uncredibly accept all of those accusations while rejecting out of hand what people are saying that they witnessed.
It's a question of whether or not it's been investigated.
It's a question of shifting the blame for what's happening to Israel instead of the terrorist group that took the people hostage. We can critique what Israel's doing all we want. We do plenty of that. But like 92% of the blame here for people being, 100% of the blame for people being murdered in their cars and at bus stops and at a music festival, and then being abducted and captured, and the conditions they're in, and them dying still. That's 92% on Hamas.
But that's it's not about shifting blame.
Well,
but the reality is that
all our time sitting around saying.
But Robbie, if I ever bring up the fact that 24,000 24,000 Palestinians have been killed in 3 months. Then the response to that is, well, that's Hamas's fault. Everything comes back to Hamas's fault, in fact, in the blame shifting, and not the fact that Israel has been
Hamas's fault?
Engaging in an occupation for 75 years, that the people who originally populated Gaza are people who were driven from their land, and the Nakba, that Israeli officials are on record repeatedly saying they want this to be a new Nakba and articulating plans to ethnically cleanse the remaining population of Gaza to surrounding states, that they have announced a strategy of collective punishment, which is a violation of international law. And now, I'm not even talking about Gazans. I'm literally trying to advocate for Israeli hostages that Israeli major newspaper is arguing are being purposefully killed strategically by their own government. And you're still framing that as me somehow advocating for Hamas. This is literally a segment about how horribly Israeli hostages are being treated in this scenario
you think that
by their own government.
The 3 who escaped, who were shot by IDF, you think they were purposefully killed?
I think they were purposefully killed, yes. I mean, obviously, a gun was aimed at them and they were purposefully killed.
You think the IDF soldiers who shot
stray
them
bullet
in their brain said, this is a fleeing hostage, this is an Israeli hostage who's coming, and I should kill them?
I think that's the question in dispute, and there is a lot of evidence that I presented in this.
I don't believe that at all.
So when the Times of Israel reports that the Hannibal Directive was stated Israeli policy as recently as 2016, why is it so incredible to you that it would continue to be policy or be reintroduced as policy in the wake of the, earth-shattering events of October 7th?
And again, you can say this policy is wrong and they ought to value the hostage's life even above eliminating a terrorist threat. But if there is, for instance, if they were, and again, the Israeli government has denied that they're doing this, but I read the reporting as well. If terrorists and hostages are together, according to this directive, it would be that, right, they shouldn't not kill killing the hostage dying as well is an acceptable outcome. Not that fleeing hostages should be killed on purpose.
But no, Rabbi, that's not right. And
I think that's insane to believe that that's Israeli government policy.
That's why it quite literally, explicitly was Israeli government policy, and that's why I included that Mearsheimer quote, because what Mearsheimer describes is the first scenario.
Again, that's
wait a minute, let me finish this. Mearsheimer describes the first scenario, which is, oh, okay, in the fog of war, you don't know exactly where people are, you're willing to take the risk of bombing a place, even though a hostage might be there. But he says that is different. Go back and listen to the clip. That is different from the Hannibal Directive, which purposefully tries to eliminate hostages that are being held by your enemy so that you are never in the position where you have to negotiate a hostage exchange.
But these hostages
in a way that's disproportionate.
They had escaped. They were fleeing toward the forces. All right. People can make up their own minds about this. More Rising right after these messages.